the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave, of the brave.
At a quick glance, sometimes it's hard to tell if anything's changed. But we know better. 2020 was the year that changed everything. This new normal isn't going anywhere. Our world and our courtrooms have been permanently disrupted by the pandemic. However, history has shown us time and time again that crisis is the mother of invention. And we've all had to innovate. The initial challenge was how to make hearings remote. The ongoing challenge is how to make remote hearings even more accessible. Because we know every case has a real impact on someone's life. But the greatest need lies with those clients who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And whatever the need is now, it's only just begun. We'll need to continue to innovate, especially when it comes to case capacity. Access to our courtrooms, whether virtual or in person, will be more important than ever. We all know virtual access isn't perfect. To begin with, not everyone even has Wi-Fi. But it hasn't all been a struggle. Virtual access has improved transportation costs for clients, downtime in between hearings, family care issues, and remote capabilities have given attorneys more time to provide higher quality legal services. We're now able to help more people than ever, in real time, every day. Our remote court proceedings and sites throughout the city continue to help provide access to all who need it. This has also garnered increased public interest in our legal system and hearing oral arguments. We've developed enhanced health and safety protocols, hybrid courtrooms, and remote interpreting, mediation, and court reporting services. Our collaboration with our criminal justice partners has helped to ensure access for detained defendants. And our interactive court forms have provided uninterrupted access and safety for the domestic violence population, among others. Hopefully, some of these best practices will continue post-pandemic. Yet, we still have a few technological challenges to overcome.
Let's now hear from counsel for appellee.
Counsel, you need to unmute yourself.
Counsel, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now, Your Honors?
We'll continue to adapt, innovate, and uphold the high standards of our legal system. The virtual courtroom is here, and justice will be done. Welcome to the 2021 District of Columbia Judicial and Bar Conference.
Good morning. My name is Anna Blackburn Rigsby, and I am the Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. It is my pleasure to call to order the 45th Judicial Conference and 11th Joint Session of the Judicial Conference with the District of Columbia Bar. We are proud of the strong relationship between the D.C. courts and the D.C. Bar, and this 11th Joint Judicial Conference is a testament to our partnership. I wish I could say it's good to be here with you, but as with most events over the past year, I will have to just say I'm so glad you logged in and are joining us this morning. I hope everyone is well and safe. Is there a motion to adopt the rules of the 45th Judicial Conference of the District of Columbia and the 11th Joint Judicial Bar Conference? Thank you, Judge Thompson, for making the motion, which has been seconded and has passed unanimously. I understand that there are no additional motions that require the attention of the conference, so there will be no need to call the conference back into session at the close of the conference. As Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals and Chair of the Joint Committee on Judicial Administration, the policy-making body for the District of Columbia Courts, I am required by D.C. Code Title 11, Section 744, to convene a conference with the Associate Judges of the D.C. Court of Appeals and the Associate and Magistrate Judges of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia to report on the state of our local judiciary, the D.C. courts. The D.C. Code says that I shall preside and all judges shall attend, and that the court shall provide for active participation by members of the D.C. Bar and other persons active in the legal profession. That's a tall order, but after all we have gone through this past year, I think we can rise to this occasion for sure. We also invite our federal judicial colleagues, partners in our local executive and legislative branches of government, members of the bar, legal service providers, and members of the public. Please take a look at the conference website to see our honored guest and all of the conference delegates. This year, as with previous conferences, we also have an exciting and highly relevant topic to explore: how COVID-19 has reshaped the legal profession. What have we learned from grappling with the administration of justice and the practice of law during this pandemic? How has it changed us? What will the new normal be? How can we continue to enhance court operations by keeping the good innovations that have helped us through this pandemic? I would like to thank our conference chair, Associate Judge Joshua Deal, co-chair, Associate Judge Catherine Kate Easterly of the D.C. Court of Appeals, and D.C. Bar President Jeffrey Steinberg, and the talented team and Committee on Arrangements. I also wish to recognize Chief Judge Anita Josie Herring of the D.C. Superior Court, and our D.C. Court's Executive Officer, Dr. Cheryl Bailey, and the members of the D.C. Court's executive team, Mr. Herb Racine, Mr. Julio Castillo, and Ms. Sabrina Dempson. It has been a pleasure and honor to work with each of you to lead the D.C. courts. I want to say a special thank you to Jeffrey Steinberg, this year's D.C. Bar President, for his tremendous leadership in expanding the pro bono capacity of our D.C. Bar, and to Robert Spagnoletti, the D.C. Bar Chief Executive Officer, for his continued leadership. The D.C. Court's vision and mission of ensuring access to justice for all has been especially important during these unprecedented times where the country and the world have faced a global pandemic, and where protests sparked by the desire for racial equity have existed across the country. The D.C. courts have sought during this time to ensure that the widest cross-section of attorneys working in the District of Columbia are able to attend this year's judicial conference. We appreciate you and all you have done. While, like many of you, I am excited to hear from our dynamic plenary panel, Chief Judge Josie Herring and I are compelled by statute to report to you today on the state of our local judiciary, and I am honored to do so now. I will first share a few updates from my perspective as chair of our D.C. Court's Joint Committee on Judicial Administration, and then I'll share a few specific updates about the D.C. Court of Appeals. Colleagues and friends, I am pleased and honored to report that the state of the D.C. courts and our local judiciary is strong. Notwithstanding the unprecedented challenges that we faced over the past year, I am proud to have served the D.C. courts now for 26 years as a magistrate judge, Superior Court Associate Judge, and Court of Appeals Associate Judge, and now as Chief Judge. Like each of you here, I share a commitment to justice and a fair and impartial judiciary that serves all people who live, work, and do business in the District of Columbia. Each day, thousands of people come before the D.C. courts to have their matters heard and their conflicts peacefully and fairly resolved. The D.C. courts are among the busiest courts of their kind in the nation. Litigants coming before the D.C. courts trust us to give them a fair shake. They also expect that their matters will be timely resolved. I am proud of the judges I serve with in the District of Columbia courts, both on the Court of Appeals and the Superior Court. But as judges, we could not do our work without the committed, values-driven court staff and managers who are dedicated to ensuring access to justice and serving all those who come before the courts. If the past year has taught me one thing, it is that I am so fortunate to work with an incredible group of committed judges, managers, and staff, and we have a legal community that is committed to ensuring access to justice, especially in the most difficult and challenging of times. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues on the D.C. Court of Appeals, the executive team of the court, our clerk of the court, Mr. Julio Castillo, our interim deputy clerk of court, Marie Robertson, and the Court of Appeals staff who worked tirelessly to ensure that cases were processed efficiently and heard remotely in the Court of Appeals under extraordinary circumstances. A special thank you to the members of the D.C. Court's Pandemic Working Group, which was established by Dr. Cheryl Bailey, the acting executive officer, and led by Mr. Herb Racine, the deputy executive officer. The group has met remotely every week over the past year, dealing with more issues than you could imagine. Everything from do we have enough sanitizing gel dispensers, to consulting with an epidemiologist, an industrial hygienist, to figuring out court protocols, making videos that explain to jurors and others what we have done at the courthouse to keep everyone safe. I have to say that every single division in the D.C. courts has done an incredible job, and I am so proud of how we have navigated all the challenges of the past year. Let me start by recognizing the court's amazing information technology division. We had courtroom clerks operating remotely within days of the shutdown. We trained judges and courtroom clerks on how to use WebEx at Superior Court and Zoom Government at the Court of Appeals. There were also daily trainings for employees for the first 2 weeks after we reduced in-person operations on how to remote in to their workplace desktops so that they could work from home. And while we were distancing and the IT division was facilitating that in innumerable ways, they also developed and deployed the DC Court's mobile app, which has gotten great reviews, especially from lawyers, since the court rules are included. It's available on Apple App and Google Play stores. I must also recognize our court security team. They maintained courthouse safety as well as security during an amazingly challenging year. Our Administrative Services Division did a great job procuring masks, disinfectant wipes, hand sanitizing gels and dispensers, and air purifiers and filters to protect those in the courthouse at a time when just buying those items was incredibly challenging. Our Administrative Services Division installed plexiglass barriers for counters and courtrooms and other safety precautions. The Capital Projects Division created videos explaining our cleaning procedures and changes to jury duty protocol. And all this while our Moultrie Courthouse building expansion was underway. And of course, our Budget and Finance Division kept us financially stable during a year when some costs were dramatically reduced. However, other costs increased, such as for cleaning and safety protocols during the pandemic. I am especially proud that during this unprecedented year, we were able to maintain access to justice, keeping up our efforts to provide legal services to those who cannot afford an attorney, and setting up remote sites in all four quadrants of our city for those who do not have a home computer or reliable Wi-Fi to participate in court proceedings or mediations via Zoom or WebEx. For these and other extraordinary and successful efforts, I thank the D.C. Court's Standing Committee on Fairness and Access, the Access to Justice Commission, the D.C. Bar, the D.C. Courts Navigators Program, and staff in both courts who answered phones, emails, and live chat requests, assisting approximately 2,000 participants. Over 87,000 callers were assisted by the D.C. Court's Information Desk. Forms Help Online provided help to court users through the interactive system that guides users in figuring out which forms they need to file and helping them fill them out. Over 16,000 court users were assisted in this way. All pandemic information was consolidated on one web page with links to text in Spanish and Amharic to ensure language access for all. The Human Resources Division of the D.C. Courts also did a tremendous job. In a matter of days last March, the division oversaw an increase in the number of Flex Place program participants, teleworkers, from 117 to over 1,000. The division kept our hiring practices in place as we added 72 new people in fiscal year 2020 and promoted 24 others and brought on over 100 law clerks and held remote orientation for new employees. The Court Center for Education and Training pivoted to conduct numerous virtual training programs, such as the first virtual management training program, a virtual family court conference, a training for new judges and employees, as well as the annual Judicial Training and Employee Conference. Our Strategic Management Division continued work on establishing a Justice Resource Center, something we are very proud of, on the court's campus that will serve as a one-stop shop to provide needed services to the community. With the support of the Strategic Management Division, the courts received 2 grants from the State Justice Institute, the first to conduct an operational assessment of the Court of Appeals, and the other to perform an assessment of the high-volume landlord and tenant, mortgage foreclosure, and debt collection courts. In short, although our buildings were closed to the public, we remained open to all, trusted by all, and continued to administer justice for all. We have also seen some exciting changes in the D.C. Court's management and staffing, and some organizational changes as well these past 2 years, since the last Judicial and Bar Conference. We're pleased to welcome Ms. Sherry Harris as the new D.C. Court's General Counsel. Additionally, Leah Gurwitz, the Director of Media and Public Relations, retired last month after almost 20 years of service with the D.C. Courts. Finally, our D.C. Court's IT division underwent a reorganization to better serve both courts. Now I'd like to begin with a few updates about the Court of Appeals, reflecting on some arrivals and departures at the Court of Appeals since our last judicial conference. Associate Judge Joshua Deal joined the court in January of 2020, and Judge John Fisher took senior status in August of 2020. Sadly, Judge William Pryor passed away last November, and he will be missed by all of us. Rachel Ferguson joined me as special counsel in January of 2020 after working in the D.C. Court of Appeals Legal Division for approximately 9 years. The D.C. Court of Appeals also saw some milestones in the past year. On August 22, 2020, we marked the 200th anniversary of the groundbreaking of our historic courthouse. You can see the video we put together on the DC Court's YouTube channel. This February was the 50th anniversary of the consolidation of a number of municipal courts, along with the DC Court of Appeals, into the current DC Court of Appeals and DC Superior Court, our DC courts. Both of these historic events deserve to be celebrated. And although the pandemic prevented us from coming together to celebrate in 2020, we still commemorated these historic milestones. One of the biggest challenges that the DC Court of Appeals has faced is the large number of judicial vacancies, which have persisted for years. And the Superior Court has experienced the same issue. On the Court of Appeals, we are down 2 judges currently, and one of these judicial vacancies has existed for nearly 8 years. The other judicial vacancy is now 4 years old. 2 vacancies on a court of 9 active judges constitutes nearly a quarter of the Court of Appeals' active judicial resources. For the Court of Appeals, these vacancies impact our ability to timely resolve cases. It is increasingly difficult also, with this many vacancies, to constitute as many 3-judge panels to hear cases as we previously did. We are one of the busiest state courts of last resort, and we do not have an intermediate appellate court like many other states. At the Court of Appeals, we have switched to oral arguments via Zoom in May of last year, and we maintain public access to our court's oral arguments by utilizing YouTube. If you had told me even a year ago that I would be appearing live on YouTube, I don't think I would have believed you. In the interest of access to justice, we've also allowed those who are not currently registered as e-filers to file via email or mail, or to use drop boxes that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the courthouse lobby. And we set up an email address to quickly respond to numerous compassionate release appeals and other emergency filings with the Court of Appeals. Despite all of these challenges, and on top of long-term judicial vacancies, the Court of Appeals succeeded in closing more than 1,200 cases in 2020, nearly as many as the year before. With the significantly lower new case filings due to the pandemic, we were able to reduce our pending caseload by 31%. The median time on appeal to complete a case was 395 days in 2020, only a modest increase of 11% over 2019 prior to the pandemic. After launching appellate mediation just a few years ago, and then launching our program for pro se parties to be able to participate with assistance from counsel, we found that both were able to operate remotely. Of the 39 Court of Appeals cases ordered to mediation last year, 31 were mediated remotely. In 4 cases, pro se litigants were served by pro bono mediation counsel panel members. And then there was the bar exam. This was a critically important issue which our court had to grapple with. While many recent graduates were willing to take the risk of an in-person bar exam. It was not something that the court felt was safe for the examinees or for the proctors or for court staff. So we made the bold decision to offer for the very first time a remote bar exam in October of 2020. I wouldn't have believed 10 years ago, not even 2 years ago, that we would offer and have available a remote bar exam. But we did it. The Committee on Admissions has now successfully administered 2 remote bar exams. The October exam, which was not a uniform bar exam, was offered to nearly 1,700 applicants. And in February, nearly 900 people took a uniform remote bar exam for the very first time. One more uniform bar exam is set to take place remotely this July. We were especially pleased at the high number of applicants who took the very first remote bar exam, bolstered by our Committee on Admissions having initiated reciprocity agreements with 12 other jurisdictions. Despite the challenges, the Committee on Admissions approved about 4,000 applicants for admission to the bar in 2020, nearly the same number as last year. And most recently, we solicited public comments on how the Court of Appeals could best make documents filed with the court more available electronically to the general public. This is in response to requests from many of you. The goal of the efforts to further access to justice for the community, not only during the pandemic, but to make access to justice easier in the future, is important to the courts, and we will continue to work towards it. I can't close my remarks today without recognizing that 2020 was a year of challenges like no other. A global pandemic, racial unrest in light of the tragic death of George Floyd, and a number of incidents in the past several years in which the nation witnessed a lack of equal treatment for persons of color as well as immigrants and those of other races. The Conference of Chief Justices, along with the Conference of State Court Administrators, unanimously passed Resolution Number 1 last July in support of racial equality and justice for all. The resolution recommended efforts that state courts across the country could undertake to identify and address racial bias and to facilitate and promote equality in all court programs, processes, and policies. The resolution of the Conference of Chief Justices also challenged courts, using the words of Bryan Stevenson, to get proximate with the challenges faced by the communities that the courts serve. Finally, the resolution resolved that courts intensify our efforts to combat racial prejudice in any form because it is inconsistent with the administration of justice and equality under the law. Our D.C. Court's Joint Committee on Judicial Administration has adopted the resolution and undertaken these efforts in our own courts. Ensuring access to justice is the number one goal of our D.C. Court's strategic plan. In 1996, the courts established the Standing Committee on Fairness and Access with the mission of ensuring that the D.C. courts are free of bias and other barriers to fairness and access in our court system. Under the current leadership of Judge Phyllis Thompson, the Standing Committee has reached out to the community and continues to do so. In 2020, the Joint Committee on Judicial Administration charged the Standing Committee to redouble its efforts to ensure that there are no policies, practices, or procedures that have a disparate impact based on race. We are committed to continuing this work and to ensuring that access to justice continues to be a priority so that the public has trust and confidence in our courts. I am so proud of all that the courts were able to do to maintain services despite the numerous challenges the past year confronted us with. Before I introduce our first plenary session, let me close by saying that we have achieved much this past year despite many challenges. There was a lot of suffering here in the District of Columbia and around the world. What's important is that we come back stronger from what we have gone through and that we make our court system even better. That's what we are committed to at the DC courts, and I look forward to embracing a new normal in which we set higher goals and achieve them, all in service to our community. And I look forward to seeing all of you in person with a handshake or a hug and without a mask sometime soon. As I close my remarks, I want to reiterate that the state of our local judiciary, the DC courts, is strong. And we are strong because of our unwavering commitment to justice. We are strong because of our dedicated and hardworking judges, managers, and staff. And most importantly, I know that the state of our local judiciary is strong because we have to be strong to protect the rights and ensure access to justice for all who come before our courts. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first plenary session, Access to Justice During the COVID-19 Pandemic, moderated by senior reporter from BuzzFeed News, Zoe Tillman. Our distinguished panelists will share the strides they have made to ensure that our most vulnerable population has equitable access to the legal system and the challenges that still lie ahead.
The district's most vulnerable residents, and specific to this discussion, how they could continue to get justice in every sense of that word. If you had to choose just one, and I realize that there have been many, what's been the most significant setback to access to justice that you've encountered in your work over the past year? And let's start with Attorney General Racine.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you for inviting me onto this esteemed panel. As you indicated, there are certainly many, many dislocations that have occurred and disproportionately fall on our brown and Black communities in the District of Columbia, as well as those who are on the bottom end of the economic rung. Obviously, job loss and the like, insecurity around paying bills, notwithstanding moratoria. I think if I were to focus on one area of concern, it would be the unknown really around domestic violence, as well as abuse and neglect of children. We know that schools and other activities are opportunities for adults to have eyes on kids. And it's oftentimes those eyes on kids in those settings that trigger an inquiry around whether a child has been abused and neglected. We've not had those kinds of eyes and ears on kids during this pandemic, and so I'm deeply concerned about the level of abuse and neglect that is not being tended to, and similarly with domestic violence. Those would be my top concerns.
Chinh, what's been your experience?
I'm going to build on what Attorney General Karl Racine had said in terms of the interrelation between job loss, catastrophic job loss, and the ability to make payments, in particular rent payments. So even before we talk about what's happened in COVID, it's all on the backdrop of DC being a community and a jurisdiction where affordability is already an issue. Over the past 15 or so years, the district has lost half of its affordable housing stock, and the centralized waiting list for subsidized housing maintained by the DC Housing Authority has been closed for 7 years, and yet still numbers just under 40,000 families. So when you look at all of that, and then you add on top of it what's happened, you have over 40% of the district residents who have lost employment income sometime in the past year and some change. And nearly 200,000 people have applied for unemployment insurance during the pandemic. I went online and checked that number this morning. And that is 4 to 5 times the number of applications for unemployment insurance before the pandemic. And what all this means is that individuals are struggling, even with moratoria in place, to be able to pay bills, to be able to make rent. And as a result, 16% of district tenants right now are not current in their rent payments as of March 2021, and 18% are reporting that they don't have, they have little or no confidence in their ability to pay rent going forward. And as Attorney General Karl Racine had said, this is a problem for all district residents, but I think it particularly affects residents of color. So of the families reporting that they are not current in their rent, a substantial number of those individuals are Black or Latinx.
And we'll definitely talk more about the eviction moratorium and what happens next. Vida, can you talk about your experience over the past year?
Sure, thank you. And I just want to thank everyone so much for including me in this panel and giving me this opportunity. So at Georgetown and the criminal clinics, we've pivoted to representing people in compassionate release cases. So for our clients, the biggest issue is access to quality health care. So because we're working on compassionate release cases, the majority of our clients are 40 years and up and have spent a significant period of time in prison. And we've been really fortunate to partner with the Georgetown Medical School. So we've been able to have Georgetown medical students and faculty review the Bureau of Prisons medical records that we've received. And in a presentation that they prepared for the medical school, they found that there were lapses in medical care, that the Bureau of Prisons medical staff was not providing adequate medical care in 60% of the cases that they've reviewed for us. And so what that means are things like the wrong medications being prescribed, labs being ordered, but when abnormal tests come back, no treatment being offered. We've heard horror stories of people in their 1 hour of recreation time waiting in line to get their medication and having to return to their cells empty-handed. And of course, this is all happening against the backdrop of COVID-19. We know that people in prison are 5 times more likely to have contracted COVID-19 than the rest of the population. So for our clients, access to justice is about access to healthcare.
And Jessica, what about you?
So like Vida, I have spent the pandemic working exclusively with incarcerated DC residents. And so I'll also speak from that angle. I do want to say that our incarcerated community members are really, really suffering right now through this crisis. To prevent the spread of COVID, many of them spend weeks or even months in solitary-like conditions. They're locked in their cells 23 or 24 hours a day. They're permitted to shower maybe only twice a week. They may have no contact with family members for weeks or months at a time. And so that is sort of the backdrop to the access to justice issues I want to discuss, and sort of the urgent need to work to get people out of prison, people who really don't need to be incarcerated anymore and who aren't a threat to public safety. The new compassionate release program in the district is working to release elderly and sick and COVID vulnerable prisoners. And that is a big step in the right direction. I think the compassionate release program has shown that the court can respond to a public health emergency. It can act quickly. And it can leverage technology effectively. I mean, this entire program has been built on WebEx, right? Not in person. What I am seeing as the big gap in access to justice for the clients that I work with is that we are not doing enough to ensure that returning citizens can succeed when they come home. And I'm talking specifically on the social services front and even more specifically on the housing front. And I'll just illustrate it with a short client story. In the program I teach at GW, my students represented a client who is 72 years old. He is chronically ill, and he had been incarcerated for 50 years, so 5 decades. His compassionate release motion was granted by the court. And the next day, the day after the court issued its order, he was put on a bus from rural Kentucky and sent back to DC with nowhere to live. Luckily, I had industrious law students kind of working around the clock on the case, calling every single organization in DC for emergency housing. But it took that kind of extraordinary dedication and perseverance on the part of law students just to ensure that a very vulnerable client emerging from a prison lockdown wouldn't land in a chaotic men's shelter on his first night home. So while I want to congratulate the court on a successful compassionate release program, I also want to highlight the divide that I'm seeing between a good legal outcome in court, winning a case on the one hand, and then a good life outcome for an individual in the community on the other hand. And I think it's that second outcome, the good life outcome, that's the justice that we want to be promoting, and that is the gap that I'm seeing in access to justice.
Let's stay with the criminal justice system for a moment. Vida, can you talk a bit more about the practical logistics of working with clients who are incarcerated during a pandemic? How has that worked or not?
It's been really difficult. So, our client, some of our students are in DC, but some aren't. They're lots of different places around the country. And all of our district residents who are serving sentences go to far-flung Bureau of Prison facilities. And so the way that we are able to communicate with our clients and create a relationship is over the phone through legal calls. But even to set those phone calls up, we have to go through Bureau of Prisons, case managers and counselors that are, responding to this crisis within their own prisons and have other responsibilities. And the DC Compassionate Release Statute and the Federal First Step Act has really changed the amount of legal calls that they are fielding. And so it takes weeks sometimes for us to reach a client. And we often have to speak with supervisors and executive assistants for the wardens just to schedule a simple legal call. It's been very difficult.
Attorney General Racine, your office, of course, touches both the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. Can you talk about how your priorities have shifted and also how the day-to-day work has changed in terms of how you respond to the needs of DC residents when you often can't physically interact with them and be out in the community as you could before?
Sure. And it's certainly been a massive impact and a massive shift in terms of the delivery of our services on behalf of the public interest of the District of Columbia. If I could just talk for 1 moment about the criminal issues and really lift up the Superior Court as well as the federal court and what they've done in regards to compassionate release and other innovations. One of the innovations that we championed at the Office of Attorney General was working with the Metropolitan Police Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Superior Court. We launched a process by which citations would be utilized far more greater in the pandemic than prior. And we're happy to see early data suggesting that in the nearly 1,000 citation cases, there haven't been significant problems around recidivism, nor have there been problems around folks not returning to court, either virtually or in person, as required. We think that's a significant development and may portend for permanency with respect to greater issuance of citations versus bringing people into jail. We know that interactions between the public and police, even on non-serious offenses, can lead to tragic results. By minimizing the number of those kinds of necessary interactions that result in arrest and bringing people down, not only reduce the incidence of potential for COVID-19, but also, keep the peace on the streets. So we're really looking forward to advocating for greater use of citations as opposed to arrests. With respect to the Office of Attorney General, we really focused a lot on consumer protection. In fact, we saw early on during the pandemic that complaints around price gouging and other consumer frauds, including fraudulent testing apparatuses and the like, really increased twofold. And so we buttressed our consumer protection team. We blanketed the city with all kinds of notice to businesses around the price gouging laws. A lot of businesses, fairly or not, were not aware of the price gouging law that took effect when the mayor declared an emergency. And that reduced the ability of businesses to increase the prices for their goods and their services. So a lot of what we were doing was educating folks to the extent that folks didn't take immediately to the education. We were happy to serve them with immediate cease and desist letters. And indeed, we had to go to court about a handful of times on an emergency basis to stop actual price gouging. Want to give you just a couple of numbers. Since the pandemic, we've been able to return just under $4 million to consumers around the issues that I mentioned, price gouging, consumer scams, and the like. And we have, sought to buttress our ability to engage with consumers by really ramping up our availability to DC residents online, as well as just good old-fashioned telephone. With that, I'll stop.
So Chinh, picking up on everything moving online for your clients, has the shift to remote court, remote access to city services been Is there a net positive to that change, a net negative somewhere in the middle in terms of making sure that they've been able to access, the justice as well as the practical necessities of life over the past year?
Let me answer that in a roundabout way. But the short answer, if I were to give you the 30-second version, is I think in the short term, just given the tremendous transition and disruption and the challenges in terms of access to technology and familiarity with technology, in the short term, it has been very difficult. That said, I really hope that in the long term, we're going to come out of this with new practices, innovative practices, new ways to connect with communities that will allow us to increase access, make things easier for individuals, use this opportunity to expand not just access to justice, but access to technology, access to services, ways that we can connect individuals to the things that they need on a day-to-day basis. So that's my kind of short answer. I think, using legal aid as an example and talking both about the general and the specific, right around March 13th to March 16th, like so many other offices and organizations, we went from being a largely in-person shop to essentially shifting all of our services and work to telephone and online. And that was a really difficult transition for us. Over the past year or so, we've had 6,000 requests for assistance. And whereas in a non-pandemic world, perhaps 85% of those contacts would have been with applicants and clients who come to one of our general or specialized intake centers and involved in-person meetings and communications, it is now entirely done on the phone and online. And that's a really difficult way to communicate with individuals, not just given the technology challenges that I described earlier, but just in terms of reviewing documents. How do you look at something, a bill, a pleading, or something, the evidence, in order to assess legal claims or legal issues? And that's really been a challenge. We've also, I think, though, used this time, and hopefully we'll get to this part later, to collaborate with the court, to collaborate with agencies, to collaborate with our partners, to work out ways that we can use this moment to speed up processes we'd already been thinking about in terms of increasing access. And so I think a lot of those collaborations have started to provide fruit that we have some optimism will be better for the community going forward.
Jessica, for clients that you work with who are incarcerated, who are going through the parole process, are there, in the shift to remote proceedings in the criminal justice world, are there changes that you think have been positive for that system and how it functions in terms of access? Or, has this really been just a short-term, make it work and we need to go back to the way it was before?
So thanks, Zoe, for asking about parole, which I think is a really important part of the criminal justice system and is not handled by the courts. Parole is handled by the U.S. Parole Commission, an independent federal agency. And that is because, as most of you know, DC lost control of much of its criminal justice system in 1997. And many, if not most, post-conviction issues are now handled by the federal government. So I can say a few words about sort of pre-pandemic, what parole looked like during the pandemic, and then maybe looking forward towards post-pandemic, if there is such a world. And there are some silver linings there. Before COVID, if I wanted my law students to represent a parole client, I was required by the Parole Commission to travel to the prison itself for the hearing and to sit in the hearing room alongside my client. And this requirement was imposed despite the fact that the hearing examiner from the Parole Commission most of the time was sitting at his desk conducting the hearing remotely by video from K Street. So you can imagine the impact on access to justice. I could only represent clients within driving distance of DC. And that meant that thousands of DC residents who are incarcerated at far-flung BOP facilities were left without a lawyer. Now, just speaking for a moment during the pandemic, the Parole Commission is allowing representation by telephone. Not great. You can't see your client. You can't see the hearing examiner. You're losing a lot of nonverbal communication. But still, even just using this 19th century technology, we've managed an enormous improvement in access to justice. So this year, for the first time, I had my law students representing people incarcerated at facilities 8 hours away, or representing people at facilities, at prisons where the closest airport was 2.5 hours away. So really, really remote prisons. People who never would have had a lawyer pre-COVID. So that's the silver lining. Now, thinking, into the future, I think here's the trick, is that we need to be building on the progress we've made and not regressing. And I'm afraid I'm already seeing signs of regression. So the Parole Commission has announced that it intends to suspend representation by phone at the end of the summer and reinstate the requirements that attorneys show up at hearings in person. I think we should be going in the opposite direction. We should not only maintain phone representation, but we should expand to video representation. We know the BOP has this capability. They put prisoners on video for their compassionate release hearings all the time. And so we need to really, as a community, ensure that we are applying the needed pressure to federal agencies that have control over our residents, and to make sure that they continue to advance access to justice and make best use of remote representation rather than eliminating it.
I'm interested in how the tech infrastructure of the local court system, jails, the rest of the broader justice system has held up to this moment. And Vida, could you talk about how, if the pandemic has exposed any shortcomings or areas where upgrades, physical upgrades could improve access, not just in the event of another crisis, but in quote unquote normal times, as you've been helping clients with pleadings and, communicating at prisons, how is the tech network that exists for all of this?
Well, I would say for most of our incarcerated clients, there is no tech network. And particularly when we're talking about older prisoners, many of them can't even use the email system, Links, to communicate. So we're really just left to telephones. But with respect to our misdemeanor clients, the misdemeanor courthouse has largely been closed through the pandemic. But the few remote hearings we've had, it's certainly better that they don't have to go in person. Our clients are some of the most vulnerable people in the district, often relying on public transportation to get from here to there. And so it's great that they don't have to appear in court. On the other hand, we have many of our misdemeanor clients are homeless and don't have even telephones. And so it's been a real challenge. I also will just give just a second to say WebEx is difficult to download for some of our clients who do have phones. And so these are all things I think we should try to look at.
Shifting back to the civil justice system, Chinh, I know that you and the Attorney General talked a bit earlier about the crisis facing residents who may have housing instability, experiencing homelessness. A huge unanswered question really from the start of the pandemic, and that's now becoming more urgent, is what happens when eviction moratoriums lift? How can you talk about how you're preparing for that future reality?
Sure. And I think that one of the causes of anxiety is that we don't really know. I think we are bracing ourselves for the worst. Tens of thousands of individuals who are behind in rent and landlords who are likely ready to file once moratoria are lifted. And those are just the sort of non-payment of rent cases. I think that's what might be some silver lining coming out of this is the increased communication and improved sort of collaboration between providers and the court to think about these potential challenges. The court, I know, independently is working on its Reimagining the Courts effort and is expected to share some reopening plans shortly on that. We have had opportunities to talk to the presiding judges of each division, especially the divisions where there are, high volume filings and high volume cases involving low income litigants. So we've had those opportunities to talk with the presiding judges and help develop those plans. There's, again, independently a National Center on State Courts project around high volume court reform. And so those ongoing communications, I think, give us some optimism that we will be able to ensure that whatever way we deal with the lifting of moratoria, there will be an opportunity for litigants to be able to access counsel, to be able to access the courts, to do things in an orderly way. I think the other piece that's encouraging about this is that among the providers, we have had a number of conversations planning for and thinking about this. During the pandemic, we have created the Landlord-Tenant Legal Access Network, which is a coalition or a collaboration among providers to be able to coordinate work and make sure that we are providing individuals an opportunity to reach out to the providers through a more coordinated way. And also we've been working through the Access to Justice Commission and through other means to collaborate with pro bono attorneys to make sure that law firms and other lawyers that are interested in trying to contribute to this effort have access not only in sort of landlord-tenant matters, but in all matters involving civil legal services. And we're really excited about this relatively new initiative called DC Represents, where law firms and other federal government and other lawyers are stepping up to commit to increasing their involvement in pro bono assistance, especially in low-income civil legal services matters.
And Chinh, I just want to quickly go back. Vida had talked about some of the practical logistical issues dealing with remote access during the pandemic. And, early on, there was also a question of the technology gap for a lot of especially vulnerable citizens in the district and across the country. I mean, has that tech gap manifested over the past year? Have you really found that there is still a gap in residents who don't have reliable internet access or a way to get remote services? And in particularly, if city agencies and the courts keep some of this remote access, is there a gap there that needs to be addressed to make sure they can download what they need to download and find what they need to find online, things like that?
Yes, absolutely. There is a gap, and I think there's almost too much here to really talk about succinctly. I would say that there's a gap initially in terms of access to a phone and technology and internet in and of itself. So there are some individuals in a remote world who are not able to get the information, not able to reach out to agencies or the courts, to the extent that the Office of Administrative Hearings, for instance, has understandably moved to a lot of communication by email. If you are an unrepresented litigant who has limited, if any, access to electronic communication, that can be really difficult or challenging. So there's that kind of initial aspect of it. And then there's the aspect of the familiarity with those tools. I'll turn this just inside to legal aid, for instance. We have a community advisory council that met in person on a quarterly basis. And during the pandemic, we have moved those meetings to online web meetings. And we have found that even with our community advisory council and a lot of effort on our part to prepare for those meetings, to provide simultaneous interpretation during those meetings. A lot of time is just spent trying to figure out tech problems, trying to get the simultaneous interpretation to work, trying to get people to turn on their cameras and get them, to mute and unmute. And so those very simple things have really presented challenges to remote hearings, to access to courts and to agencies. I am somewhat empathetic to the court in trying to solve a solution, and also to the agencies, because I think they are also overwhelmed with trying to figure out this difficulty and this transition. And so it is something that we need to work through and continue to work through, but really focus on for our client community.
Attorney General Racine, can you talk about the responsibility of your office and city government as we move towards, as Chinh was discussing, a reality where the eviction moratorium lifts? We've had, delays in debt cases. There have been stimulus checks. As those safety nets are pulled back, what is your responsibility during this transition period?
Sure. Thank you for the excellent question. I think from the Office of Attorney General perspective and our mandate to use our resources in a manner that is consistent with the public interest, it's incumbent upon us to team with legal aid and other providers to make sure that vulnerable DC residents do not find themselves on the wrong side of the tsunami of eviction cases that are going to come about. And I think it's incredibly important work that's been done by legal aid and others to stand up, ready to go, pro bono services beyond legal aid, so that folks have lawyers. What's also really important is to get the word out into the very community that oftentimes doesn't get the level of communication that other communities might receive, that there is help, and that the help really needs to find the people who need it most. One of the areas I'm deeply concerned about is just the lack of money, right? I mean, a moratoria is lifted, immediately a payment becomes due. Where are people going to find the money to make the payments that can forestall eviction? And I think that's where the government, beyond certainly the Office of Attorney General, needs to come in and be creative in providing low interest loans, a lot of grants to allow people to remain in their homes. We're also concerned that vulnerable communities, generally speaking, don't complain as much when things are happening to them that are not right. And so we know, for example, that there's going to be a whole lot of debt collection efforts once the moratorium lifts. There are going to be a whole bunch of scammers who are seeking to help people with their credit counseling services. And there'll be a whole bunch of wrongdoers trying to take what little money people have away from them. We've also seen, quite disturbingly, an increase in the efforts of so-called fintech companies to come into the District of Columbia via the internet and to make usurious loans that get to the level very quickly of over 200%. And people in dire financial straits will do what they need to do in order to take care of their loved ones, which includes entering into those kinds of usurious, outrageous, sort of immediate loan provisions. So we're preparing ourselves and working hard to team with both the FTC as well as the CFPB in regards to what we know will be a field day for folks who are seeking to take advantage of the least able amongst us.
And Attorney General, staying with you for a moment, how do you feel your office in the city has handled doing remote outreach and making information available to residents remotely. I remember reading there were some issues with, I think someone mentioned interpretation, having materials accessible in different languages online when you can't have people going out into those communities. How do you think the city has handled communicating outward to residents and making sure that the city is responsive in a remote setting?
Sure. Let me just speak for the office that
I know you can't speak for the whole city government, but you're here, so sorry.
Indeed. Now, we've redoubled our efforts in a real way in regards to consumer engagement, where we have lawyers and professionals who are not in the consumer engagement shop, who are quite actively engaged in communities. We've done everything we possibly can to, for example, to make sure that folks in the early days of the pandemic actually had access to PPE, were getting the correct, kind of medical information about keeping a distance, about outside being safer than inside. And we've, sort of continued to do that around issues concerning the distribution and access of the vaccine. You might know that we have a team called the Cure the Streets Violence Interrupters, and they've been phenomenal in regards to accessing aspects of the DC community, that aren't well accessed, and getting the word out about protecting yourself, about the facts concerning the vaccine, so that people can make educated, decisions around that. I can't wait for the pandemic to ease so that we can get out more in person. And there is no doubt that, notwithstanding the technology, I think that there are pockets of the city that have proven to be extremely hard to penetrate, and therefore extremely hard to support. So we all, including the Office of Attorney General, can do better in this regard.
Jessica, you talked earlier about the challenges facing returning citizens during the pandemic. And I was hoping you could talk a bit more about, what you would like to see the post-pandemic world look like for them. Are there takeaways from remote access that would be helpful in easing their transition in the future? Is there, what more can be done to support them as we come through this transition period?
So I think, for better or worse, the pandemic has ushered in the era of tech. I don't think we're going back. And so for me, the question is, how can we do it better? How can we leverage this resource to help our returning citizens? And maybe I'll start with something that we do have in the district, which will help put a finer point on what we don't have, but what we need. And that is that HHS, when the pandemic hit, at the behest of advocates in the community, created an app to allow people to apply for food stamps and interim disability assistance and other public benefits through their smartphones. And this makes public benefits, eminently accessible, even during the pandemic when physical offices are shut down. And I think the crucial part here of the way tech was used is that it's through an app, not a website. So when we talk about the tech gap, what I have found, and there's been a good amount of research to support this, is that many low-income community members don't have a laptop, don't have access to good Wi-Fi, but they do have smartphones. At least a larger number have smartphones, and they have data, at least some data. And so putting resources online isn't good enough. We need apps that are smartphone compatible. So that's what we do have. What don't we have, and what do we need? Well, housing for me is the big one. We don't have any coordinated way for a returning citizen or for anyone, for that matter, to locate an emergency bed or transitional housing for the longer term. There are dozens and dozens of nonprofit and governmental entities offering housing, but nobody has developed an app that a person can click on to see where a bed might be available tonight, right? We don't have a centralized repository of this information that updates continuously and is accessible on your smartphone. So that would be a huge, huge leap forward. And I'll say the same goes for Medicaid. We haven't yet figured out how to make that process more intuitive and available to apply for via smartphone. So, housing and Medicaid, which I would consider really the two linchpins for community success when it comes to a returning citizen, those public benefits are not easily accessible.
That's a really interesting point. Chinh, is there an app or some kind of mobile functionality that would really make a difference for your clients, thinking about lessons learned from their remote access issues during the pandemic? What could that look like?
I'm responding off the cuff
I know you're not
here.
a tech developer, but
yeah. But I think it's an intriguing idea. I definitely agree with Jessica that the research suggests that while regular access to broadband and computers is less common in low-income communities, that there are a larger number of individuals who do have access to a smartphone. I think limited data remains an issue, but smartphones are more prevalent. I think that to me, just reacting off the cuff, is that apps can be very helpful in the long run if we get into a habit and an expectation that you download apps for these purposes. I think one thing about apps is you kind of have to know about them, or you kind of have to figure out that they're out there. And the thing about websites, for better or worse, is you Google Medicaid and you're going to go to a website. Now, whether or not you have to navigate that website 5 times to figure out where to go, that's another question. But I think that if we can get into the expectation that some of these services are available through apps, and if we can get real-time information like what Jessica is suggesting, then I do think that there is some possibility there for greater access to services. Regular updating is really a key thing, because during this pandemic, what has been a challenge for getting the word out to our client community has been the continuing evolving nature of all of these things. Recertifications are suspended, recertifications are starting up. All of these in-person activities are now shifted to online. Here's the number you can reach. We have a new resource from the DC government for people who are behind in rent. All of this information is changing throughout the time period of this pandemic. And we at Legal Aid are trying to keep up with that, to provide a regularly updated resource guide for individuals and pro se resource materials for individuals, but keeping all of that updated and translating it into different languages to make sure that we are compliant with our own language access expectations of the district is a real challenge in this time when things are quickly changing. The DC Council is passing emergency legislation. The agencies are changing their policies. We really need to get that information out to the community.
Vida, I want to shift back to the criminal justice system. And you and others have talked about over the past year, this effort to really immediately address the COVID crisis in jails by moving towards a decarceration focus. How do people get out of these hotspots? How do you stop people from going in? Are there takeaways from how the courts have responded to that change that you would like to see carry through after this crisis has subsided? Is there a continued focus on decarceration, or do you expect, pre-pandemic status quo to resume?
I'll just say this has been the one bright spot of the pandemic, is that we as a legal community have been able to focus on aging prisoners who've spent significant periods of time in prison. We in the district have so much stacked against us. When you think about the criminal legal system of the District of Columbia, it's one of a lot of inequities and unfairnesses. There are more than 4,000 people serving DC Superior Court sentences in the federal prison. And we believe that more than 95% of those people are Black. We also know that the sentences that were handed out in the 80s and 90s were in many instances draconian. And this has given us as a legal community a chance to go back and look at some of the mistakes of our past. I have been absolutely blown away by the fact that so many of our clients have maintained relationships with their friends, their neighbors, and their families despite decades of incarceration. So while we as a legal community may have forgotten about many of these people, the rest of the community has not. They're in contact with so many DC citizens who are serving sentences in places that are very hostile to them. Their care is entrusted to people who don't have their best interests at heart. And so this is an opportunity that we have as a legal community to fix these problems and to go back and look at these old cases. I'm really hopeful that that focus can continue. I think the work of the courthouse is much better served in decarceration than sending more people back to prison.
I have a few more questions for the panel, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. So I just wanted to let everyone know, a reminder to drop your questions in the chat box, and we'll move to those shortly, but feel free to start doing that. The Attorney General Racine, jumping off of what Vida was talking about, you spoke earlier about your office's support for some of these decarceration efforts, trying to limit contact with police on the street, limiting the number of people who are going into the DC jail. Are there changes that you support moving forward after we emerge from this crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that our criminal justice system continues to struggle with a really, really wide front door of entry into it. In other words, over policing, arresting, and then too many cases coming into the criminal justice system. And then the back door, the way out, continues to be far too narrow, with not enough resources, as we've discussed already, to get people the housing, the mental health, and the job preparation skills that they need. Notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding an increase in gun violence and homicides, I'm heartened by the posture of the courts, as well as the DC City Council, continuing to explore ways to provide meaningful second chance opportunities, reassessment, if you will, of whether an inmate remains a hazard to public safety, or whether their time in jail can be demonstrated to have been, as reflected by their conduct, a time period where they have excelled, and strongly indicate that they'll be peaceful once they're released. I think that these kinds of reforms will continue, and I credit the Council, the District of Columbia, for remaining steadfast in that regard. Just want to emphasize again what I said earlier, and that is the increased use of citations allows police officers to spend their time in a much better way than the time-consuming process that's often involved in processing nonviolent offenders through the criminal justice system, through arrest and in jail, and arraignment and initial presentment. I think the data is strong and suggests that there's really not a great risk to public safety for those kinds of cases that can be subject to citations. And that will certainly result in a narrowing of the front door. So I remain a proponent of those kinds of fair and just measures.
As we start to have questions come in the chat box, I'll pose to the entire panel a version of that last question, and really one that's been a common thread through all of this, which is, what are takeaways that can help access to justice post-pandemic? What changes have we all been forced to make? Have systems been forced to make that have improved access for the people that you work with? Jessica, why don't you start?
I think, I'll echo a lot of what has been said already, which is that tech has its upsides. It certainly has its downsides, but it does have its upsides. One of the things that I've thought a lot about during the pandemic is how do we make sure, and I'm kind of responding to Chinh here, how do we make sure that people know where the services are available, especially in an online world where you can't go to a physical office? And an online world may be preferable in some circumstances. Because when you go to a physical office, you show up, you may not have an appointment, you may sit in a waiting room for hours, you may be with your small kids, you may be missing work, right? So where do we put, we don't have a city that provides free social work services to our residents. You can't go into an office and get a social worker to help you with your Medicaid application, for instance. But we could, I'm dreaming here, right? This is sort of a big dream, but I wonder if the court might help serve as a hub for social services in the city in some sort of online capacity. And I say this because legal self-help has become so ubiquitous. There are self-help portals and kiosks and websites that you can avail yourself of in order to help you with your case, usually in the civil justice system. Do we want to think about kiosks and portals or even social workers on site at the court once they open more, more physically to folks? Do we want to think about having that for, a returning citizen to get their birth certificate or their driver's license or apply for SSI or any of the many needed services they require when they come home? They pass through the court, and might that be a hub? And I realize I'm dreaming big here, and we're a long way away from something like that. But the court really is our institution of last resort for our most vulnerable residents. And once they leave the court, it's just, they're scattered among dozens of institutions and agencies available to help, but with little in the way to help them navigate that system.
Chinh, any final thoughts on changes going forward?
Sure. Let me build on what Jessica said. That if we're dreaming, and I think this is something that we're on the path of, we need to also understand that accessibility is about individuals being able to understand what government and courts are trying to communicate. And one of the things that legal aid has really put a lot of effort into in recent months and years is trying to think of accessibility that way in terms of court notices, letters. If you want access to your a copy of your birth certificate, there's too much of a rigmarole to get that. And how can we simplify that process? How can we simplify waivers for court fees? How can we simplify what the notices you get that tells you what you're being sued for? Sometimes, it takes a lawyer, and even a very well-trained lawyer, not just any lawyer, to understand what these documents mean. And so I think that's just building on what Jessica said. But I think in terms of a potential bright spot, I started to talk about the collaborations that in a way COVID has forced and accelerated. We've always tried within the legal services community to coordinate our services, but the circumstances of the pandemic have really accelerated those conversations. So I talked about the landlord tenant legal assistance network, but across several different areas of high volume practice, there has been greater coordination. There is now a family law assistance network that is strengthened and served a large number of people. There's a debt collection defense hotline that has been created that's a collaboration across several different legal services organizations. There was already a child support resource center, but that has also been converted to a hotline that's a coordination. At the Office of Administrative Hearings, there's a legal assistance network. So you're seeing a lot of coordination, and all of that coordination has to work with the courts and work with the Office of Administrative Hearings to make work. And I'm hoping that that will be something we can be proud of coming out of the pandemic.
We have a few minutes left and some questions starting to come into the chat box. So I'm going to move over to those now. And this one I'm going to read almost verbatim for reasons you'll understand. Eric Angel posts a great point by Jessica for Attorney General and former legal aid board member Karl Racine. Sorry to put you on the spot,
okay.
But would the AG be interested in working with the court and the administration and legal services community in exploring the creation of additional remote courthouse sites for civil cases, even after the pandemic is over? Parentheses, insert smiley face emoji here.
Well, with a name like Eric and a last name like Angel, we know the question comes from a good place. Look, let me just say two things. First, I do think that the very, very, very subtle, non-attention grabbing hero in a lot of the work that we're talking about here has been the court. And, you know, the court, first with former Chief Judge Morin, really moved adroitly and rapidly to move to a virtual posture. The court, even before the council, moved to really reduce the accessibility of rent, evictions and other types of cases that would have really hurt our less well-to-do population. And of course, the current Chief Judge, Anita Josie Herring, has only doubled down on the great work that Justice Morin has done. And so I feel compelled to mention that in the context of Eric's question, because the answer is a resounding yes. I'm happy, the Office of Attorney General is, to partner with the court and legal aid and others to ensure that access issues are alleviated, ameliorated, and that more vulnerable folks in the District of Columbia have the access to justice that they deserve. Their very well-being and that of their kids is at stake. I'm reminded of the book Evicted by Mr. Diamond. And you'll remember that in that book, there's just painstaking, heart-wrenching stories about the folks who are actually being evicted without counsel. 97% of large number of these evictions occur without a tenant having a lawyer. The startling statistic for me is the average age of a person who is evicted. The average age of the person who was evicted during the economic recession period was 9 years old. You know why that is? It's because the average person who is evicted is a mother with more than one child. And so these are not theoretical issues. These are real issues that impact the very health and safety and well-being of our children. So I'm looking forward to teaming up with legal aid and the court.
Well, that brings us to the end of our session. I think great to end on a moment of connection, even virtually and over Zoom. We're making it happen. So I just want to thank all of our panelists again for joining us this morning. I think it's been a really great discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all in person back in court at some point in the near future. So I'll turn it back over now to the conference administrators.
Wow, what a great start to our morning. Thank you to Ms. Tillman and all of our esteemed panelists. Now I am pleased to introduce Chief Judge Anita Josie Herring of the District of Columbia Superior Court.
Thank you, Chief Judge Blackburn-Rigsby. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're online with us and pleased to be able to deliver my first ever judicial conference remarks. I'm even more pleased to be able to report all that the Superior Court has been able to accomplish this past year, despite all the challenges we as a court, as a community, as a city, and all of us have been dealing with. The COVID-19 pandemic has required immediate implementation of an emergency plan with many adjustments along the way. A significant number of employees were set up to work remotely very quickly, with C10 not missing one day of operations. Within a month, we had numerous courtrooms set up for remote and partially remote hearings, and within several months, we were virtually entirely virtual. We currently have 86 remote courtrooms with WebEx access information and links, as well as tip sheets available on our coronavirus page. Let me give you a sense of some of the highlights of a year of many challenges, but also of great accomplishment. Last year, the court's IT division added a bulk filing capability designed for clerks' office staff responsible for transmitting a large number of process filings back to filers each day. This will help us realize significant time savings. In early summer 2020, the court began offering the option of online payment processing for document copy requests, protective order payments, certain filing fees, marriage license applications, bonds, and transcripts. While this was initially done to respond to the need to handle payments without having court staff on site, we now intend to continue this service indefinitely. When the pandemic struck, the Civil Division quickly and dramatically expanded the case types available for electronic filing. The division partnered with the court's electronic service provider, File and Serve Express, to create several helpful videos to guide self-represented filers through the electronic filing process. Ongoing collaboration with legal service providers and external stakeholders were critical to our successful operations during the pandemic. For example, the DC Bar Pro Bono Center operates the Consumer Law Resource Center, which assisted over 300 people remotely last year. Neighborhood Legal Services operates the Small Claims Resource Center, which resumed operations remotely on July 1st of last year. In September, the Legal Aid Society, Zedek DC, Catholic Charities Legal Network, DC Bar's Pro Bono Center, Legal Counsel for the Elderly, and Neighborhood Legal Services launched the Debt Collection Defense Hotline, helping 26 individuals by phone and sending out over 1,000 letters to defendants with pending debt collection cases to provide information on their rights and the availability of free legal assistance. Beginning June 1st of last year, Bread for the City, the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, the Legal Aid Society, the Legal Counsel for the Elderly, Neighborhood Legal Services, and Rising for Justice came together to launch the Landlord and Tenant Legal Assistance Network, which helped nearly 1,500 individuals with landlord and tenant cases. Legal Aid Society and the Legal Counsel for the Elderly have also provided help to those at risk of losing their homes to foreclosure. When COVID struck, attorneys from these organizations continued to help clients doing pre- and post-hearing outreach and participating in remote court hearings. Their efforts helped over 1,800 respondents, as well as providing information to nearly 700 homeowners about their rights and available resources. Last year, the Criminal Division held over 16,500 remote hearings in 21 courtrooms. The court's mental health urgent care clinic served 182 individuals in 2020. During the initial response to the pandemic, the clinic began offering continued remote services to existing clients and was available for emergency services at the courthouse. However, the clinic was closed for new intakes from March 20th until July the 27th. On September 16th, the urgent care clinic resumed limited in-person walk-in hours and has continued to work at that level of operations. In November 2020, the Criminal Division implemented the Electronic Evidence Initiative, enabling prosecutors and defense attorneys to submit trial exhibits electronically. With the help of the DC SAFE and other victim assistance partner agencies, the CVCP continue to support victims. CVCP transitioned to remote operations by allowing claimants to file applications by way of email. Staff are now on site in the Moultrie information booth 2 mornings a week to assist victims of violent crimes with their application intake process and inquiries. Applications can also be completed and dropped off at one of our community barge centers. In March 2020, the Domestic Violence Division immediately implemented a remote clerk's office and continued to accept filings. As a result, we avoided any gap in service. The division has accepted and processed over 6,000 filings electronically. The division leveraged existing partnerships with legal service providers in the Metropolitan Police Department to adapt existing procedures to remote operations and ensure filers could request emergency orders, submit all filings electronically, request and receive personal service, access case information, and courtrooms. To do so, the DVD, or the Domestic Violence Division, updated its pro bono.net interviews to facilitate remote electronic filings and resource sharing with the public. Starting November 2020, judges in the division began hearing civil protection order trials and implemented a confidential remote check-in process and remote negotiation procedures. The division also held over 1,500 misdemeanor criminal hearings. The Family Court Call Center assisted over 61,000 customers in 2020, a 48% increase over 2019. Our self-help centers in family and probate transitioned to virtual operations once the pandemic hit. The Family Court Self-Help Center alone served over 6,000 DC residents. In July, Bread for the City and DC Legal Aid came together to form and staff the Child Support Resource Center hotline. In addition, at the end of March, the DC Affordable Law Firm, DC Bar Pro Bono Center, and the Legal Aid Society formed the Family Law Assistance Network, FLAN, which provides rapid response, limited scope legal services to self-represented, low-income DC residents. FLAN helped over 1,200 people. All family court courtrooms operate remotely, including juvenile arraignments, as a result of a partnership with DYRS and Court Social Services. Over 11,000 virtual hearings were held in family court last year. All family court case types can now be initiated electronically. Judicial review of pre-petition custody orders, which was once a mostly manual process, is now completely electronic. And after initially closing the Marriage Bureau when the pandemic struck in March 2020, last April, the court began processing marriage applications online and performing weddings by way of WebEx. From April to the end of February 2021, family court staff and judges performed nearly 1,000 remote weddings, and staff issued over 4,500 marriage licenses. And we did not let COVID stop Adoptions Day, the highlight of our year and the year of so many. Our perennial host, Barbara Harrison, created a video with dozens of families who were interviewed and whose adoptions were finalized last fall. If you haven't seen it, please go to the DC Court's Facebook page or YouTube channel. It'll bring a smile to your face. From January 1st to March 24th of last year, there were just over 4,000 customers served in person and via the telephone and live chat. In the remaining 9+ months of the year, staff helped over 21,000 customers by way of email, live chat, and telephone. During this period, the Self-Help Center reviewed approximately 254 submissions by way of mail and email. The Probate Division successfully moved the intervention proceeding process guardianships and conservatorships for vulnerable adults to be completely virtual from initial filing to hearing. The tax division successfully closed out the final year of its 3-year plan to improve disposition rates, increasing its time to disposition success rate from 65% to 97%, a 50% increase. The division has also implemented a secure electronic transmission system for certified final orders, eliminating manual processes and in-person delivery to the DC Office of Tax and Revenue that would have delayed the payment of tax refunds during the pandemic. During March and April of last year, Multidor developed a remote mediation process, secured an online platform, and created the necessary documents, forms, and training for supporting this operation in all our mediation programs. Remote mediation operations began mid-May for civil actions cases, followed by small claims and debt collections cases, landlord and tenant and probate cases during the months of July and August. Statistical data for all remote mediation programs show that settlement rates were equal to and or higher than settlement rates for pre-pandemic in-person mediations. In addition, the division will launch an online version of its PAC program online in April. PAC is the education seminar for parents in contested custody disputes. Pre-COVID PAC was held in person 2 Saturdays per month. And Multidor continues to assist the Latinx community with its community partner, CARESON, the Central American Resource Center, offering bilingual dispute resolution services remotely to individuals with employment, consumer, tenant, neighbor conflicts, and other issues. This past year, 22% of the cases were resolved at intake, requiring no further court involvement. During the pandemic, Multidor provided 108 training sessions to its roster. The significant increase in training offered this past year was a result of intense focus on helping mediators adapt to providing mediation services remotely. Additionally, Multidor created 4 short YouTube videos to supplement learning specific skills essential to mediate on remote platforms. From mid-March 2020 until November 2020, the court did not summon any jurors. By January of this year, the juror's office implemented electronic summonses and conducted virtual grand jury enrollments for the first time since COVID struck DC. Twice as many prospective grand jurors appeared virtually than those who appear at the courthouse, and new panels of 30 grand jurors were delivered to the United States Attorney's Office as requested. Petit jurors returned for criminal cases in early April, and civil jury trials will resume in May. The Office of Court Interpreting Service closed out the inaugural year of the DC Court's Interpreter Registry with a 16% increase in the number of certified and qualified interpreters, and conducted over 150 mandatory training sessions remotely for new and veteran interpreters during the pandemic. OCIS also developed the nation's first ever Amharic Court Interpreter Certification exam. The Child Care Center moved into its new space and received its operating license. Interpreters were provided in over 2,600 court events, Spanish mostly, but also ASL, Amharic, Tigrinya, French, Vietnamese, Arabic, and Russian. The Office of Court Interpreter Service developed the first nationwide Amharic Court Interpreter Certification exam in collaboration with the National Center for State Courts. This past December, we offered the first Amharic skill building workshop for interpreters who intend to take the exam. We also hired an ASL staff interpreter in 2020 to interpret court hearings as well as assist with other events and informational videos. The court's navigation program assisted in setting up the 5 remote hearing sites where DC residents can go if they don't have a computer or Wi-Fi at home. We successfully implemented or enhanced electronic sign-in systems in the civil, criminal, and domestic violence divisions. Time-certain scheduling was used throughout the year for all hearings, including all of those that were remote. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Superior Court bench. We are currently down 12. Yes, we have 12 vacancies on our bench, yet we accomplished so much this past year. The judges and their staff at the Superior Court adapted quickly to necessary changes to include virtual hearings, teleworking, managing a growing caseload of compassionate release and other motions for relief by those incarcerated, responded to legislative requirements to seal several 100,000 landlord and tenant records, continued addressing pressing family law matters affecting children and families, worked with stakeholders to develop new ways to assist the elderly in probate matters, and ensured that access to the courts and the domestic violence division and in those cases was maintained 24/7 during these crucial times. Additionally, the presiding and deputy presiding judges serving during the period of the pandemic have been creative, dynamic, and dedicated to moving the Superior Court forward to restore operations and continue our essential constitutional mission to fairly resolve cases and controversies in the court. I am appreciative of all of my fellow judges who pulled together and made things work in this brave new world of remote hearings and telework, and I'd like to welcome our new members of the Superior Court bench, Associate Judges Brandt, Crowell, Hertzfeld, Israel, and Park, and Magistrate Judges Beatty, Arthur, Pipe, Scott, and Trabal. This has been an unprecedented year for all of us, and we have had to go without celebrations, commemorations of all sorts of events. Sadly, one of those events was the 50th anniversary of the consolidation of the DC courts, with the new DC Superior Court handling cases previously before judges in the U.S. District Court, the General Sessions Court, and the Juvenile Court. Together with the DC Court of Appeals, we officially became the DC courts on Monday, February 1st, 1971. At the ceremonial joint opening session that day, Justice Warren Burger called for a new way of thinking. According to the Washington Post, the Chief Justice urged each judge to raise his thinking from being a municipal court to the highest order of judge. Attorney General John Mitchell also spoke at that ceremony, saying, "Our great federal city now sets an example for justice and law enforcement everywhere in the land, with the Superior Court and the expanded DC Court of Appeals. It's great." We have come a long way since then, of course, with many remarkable accomplishments. I will conclude my remarks today with a quote from Dickens to summarize my take on 2020. "It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The virus has taken hundreds of thousands of lives across our country, over 1,000 just here in DC. We have all been touched by it in some way, though some far worse than others. Some have lost a loved one, some have lost a job. Our kids have lost time in school. Weddings and graduations became Zoom events. We went without seeing our loved ones and skipped family holiday traditions. It was a difficult, sad, and isolating year in many ways. But 2020 also taught us many valuable lessons: to hug when we can, to appreciate those times when we sit across the table from one another, to focus on what is most important to us. At the courts, we have learned just how much we as a team, as a legal community, can accomplish when we work together. We learned the value of technology. We learned the value of teamwork and collaboration. which I think we were good at before, but we increased astronomically this past year. We learned the importance of remaining true to our values, our vision, and our mission. Of course, we also learned that dogs bark and kids interrupt us while we're on remote conference calls, and that's okay. We learned the importance of the mute button. We learned how to apply virtual backgrounds for a change-up or to hide a messy home office space. We learned the importance of human contact and learned how to watch out for each other emotionally. We learned that it's okay to mention our mental health, so at DC Superior Court we will continue with and build upon our efforts. Our challenge now is to take the lessons learned over the years, and especially over the past year, and use those lessons to inform our decisions about our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Judge Josie Herring, for your report on the District of Columbia Superior Court. The second half of our program today features CLE-eligible breakout sessions. To access those sessions, go to the left side of your screen and click on the menu tab labeled Breakout Sessions. Then click on the program of your choice. For those of you who are not attending the breakouts, we will be reconvening tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with a report from DC Bar President Jeffrey Steinberg, followed by a keynote discussion with DeMaurice Smith from the NFL Players Association, moderated by the Honorable Judge Joshua Deal. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the breakout sessions.